Okay, let's start this film school network noise off. I'm very pleased to have John Sherman with me. I am Emiliano Galigani. I'm the director of the Film School Network. John Sherman is an associate professor of film at Kenyon College, teaches screenwriting and film history at Kenyon, and he's also a director. His new feature film is They, Them, Us, and is currently in post production, John. And his other films are I'm with Lucy and Breathing Room. So, my interest is, John, first of all, welcome. Thanks for being here with us. And I know that you've been directing They Them Us, which is your last production during the COVID. So tell us something more about the movie and how it was doing it during the COVID time.
Yeah. So I'm a New York director. I'm from New York, but I've lived in Ohio. I moved to teach at Kenyon about 10 years ago. So I live in Columbus, Ohio, which is, sort of a medium-sized city in the Midwest. And it's a city that I hadn't seen on film before. And I think it's got a lot of production value. So I wrote this comedy to be filmed here. So I wrote it in locations that I knew that would make the city look good and also do it more low budget. A lot, 60 pages out of the 100 pages are set inside one location. So I tried to make it cheaply, and we got the actors and the money all was starting to come together, and then the COVID hit and we had to decide what to do. We were going to shoot last June and we couldn't make that deadline, and then in August we had the money and we just decided that we should try to do it. And we had crew from all over the place. We had to put them up, and the actors union here, the Screen Actors Guild, there were almost no movies shooting in the country at the time. We were one of the few, although I think some movies were doing it secretly and didn't tell, but we had to talk to the union and explain to them what we were doing. And they said, okay, you can do it if you can test 3 days a week. And that was very expensive because the production had to pay for it. So we went over budget by about 20%. That's pretty much what you can expect now with the COVID protocols that you need if you're going to try to make a movie. Everyone, all the crew was wearing masks, except the actors after they went through the makeup. So we had to take care of them and make sure they were okay. But we had 20 days to do it. And it was a sprint, but nobody got sick. Nobody got COVID. So we were very
So,
lucky.
because of the COVID regulation, you had to go over budget about 20%. Is
Mhm.
that right?
Yeah. That's how much the testing costs because it's private. We don't have, I don't know how it is in Italy, but you really can't get the government to pay for it here, and it doesn't really get covered by health insurance because these are voluntary tests. It's not like anyone was sick. It was just to see that everyone was healthy. But you can't get a film crew together and have one person be positive because the whole crew would be affected and
Yeah,
nobody.
yeah, of course. The same is in Italy, and you have to be tested. The actors have to be tested every 2 days, and it's all completely on the production side. So there's no government help in this case. So yeah, it is a high budget that is a high expense that you have to. Up to this moment, there is no relief, no help from the government, but you have to do it yourself. So it's a mess. Uh,
Are movies and TV filming in Italy right now?
well, they are proceeding with all the regulation, and I've seen some good. I have to say that the ones that are proceeding in a best way are the big productions. So like Netflix. Netflix did a couple of production lately, and budgets over, let's say, a million and a half. The low cost movies are suffering a lot
Yeah.
because they don't have the means of production. So this is quite difficult. And but this is crazy also what you experienced and how long you've been shooting, John.
it was a 20-day shoot.
Wow.
So the first almost 10 days were in one location, which was great in the sense that the company didn't have to move, but we were right on top of each other in this house. And, you're supposed to be 6 feet apart. I don't know if you guys have the same, but I guess 2 meters or something distance,
Yeah.
and then I would go downstairs, where people were gathered around the monitors and they'd all be tight like that. And we'd scream like 6 feet, 6 feet, and try to get people to understand. It just, they forget crews, they're used to working a certain way and they just go back to the way that they're used to working. So
And
yeah,
you had a sort of control on set of somebody.
yeah, we did have someone who was the COVID organizer, but maybe they were outside doing some cleaning or
Yeah.
something, because you have a different, you've got the holding area where the actors are, and it's very difficult to maintain, and and then you have to make sure the crew doesn't go out at night, and you just have to hope for the best, because in Ohio, at least, the restaurants and the bars were open, and they still are. So it's tough. You have to trust people and hope that they'll do the right thing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
You never know. Yeah.
you never know. But
Okay.
it's done.
So let's start with the heart of our discussion. John is using in his classes. He's using Western genre to teach his students, and this was somehow peculiar to us. It appears very peculiar, so we invited John, especially because we are interested to know how he's working with his students and with Western. And there are a lot of questions in that. I'm a fan of Western movies, the old Westerns and the new ones, and how it evolved during the history. And also, there is a huge interest in Italy for Westerns because of Sergio Leone, and not only Leone, but Corbucci too, and how the American ways of doing Western has been also influenced somehow. I mean, Tarantino, for example, by Corbucci and Django. We influence each other somehow on a genre, which is something interesting, even on a educational side. So my questions are, I have a lot of questions, but please, John, tell me more, tell us more about how you uh, teach students. You use the Westerns to teach your students.
Yeah. So the most important thing, I think, the way we're not technically a film school. We're a film major within a liberal arts school. So, my job is to teach them within sort of a liberal arts context. So to learn to think about film analysis too, in addition to filmmaking. So when I teach the film genre classes, I'm always teaching with one eye towards helping the students understand why the choices are made that the filmmakers make and the screenplays. So we look at Westerns because they are such a visual genre. This is a genre that um, directors will try to use as little dialogue as possible to tell the story, and that helps them understand. When film students first start, they tend to write dialogue. Just everything's the characters talking, 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 and we're trying to help them understand how to tell the stories visually. So you can start and look at, say, some John Ford silent westerns, to see how he learned to tell stories without words. And it's a genre that, by the time you get to, say, Sergio Leone, like, the characters barely say a word, and the story is almost completely told visually and pictorially and music and editing. And this is a great lesson for our students, whether you're watching The Searchers, and the scene where the Native Americans attack the house, a totally visual sequence, or the shootout, the final shootout in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is a masterclass in editing and long lenses. These are movies that you can show film students how to tell stories visually and that they don't need dialogue. So that's one aspect of what's interesting about teaching Westerns. And then the other one is that Americans have used the genre as sort of a way to hold a mirror up to the culture, throughout the years. So we were talking before that, like, after World War II, you have a country that feels good about itself and its mission in the world, and that it's on the right side of history. So morally, you get these much more straightforward, simple movies. There's good and then there's bad, you know, and you're used to that when you think of the good guys versus the bad guys. But of course, like, what is that like? If the good guys are the cowboys and the bad ones are the Indians, then you have all kinds of other issues you can start to explore, and how, Americans' attitude towards race. And especially now with what's going on with America, there's a reading of Westerns where it's all about being white, like being white is good. And that's a good way to understand the framework that America was founded upon, which is really kind of the structural racism that's baked into the way the country was built. So it becomes a very powerful way to look at, it was not something that was intended by these filmmakers, they just assumed it. But it's a great way to sort of think about the issues that we're dealing with now in America and American universities. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a white person? And is that what Americans are? We're facing that right now. So it's a genre that you can constantly read into how Americans see themselves and what the country means, and this idea of the frontier, this idea of freedom and guns, like guns are power in a Western, and
Yeah.
being able to use a gun, is something that Americans now, they're so attached to this idea. So a lot of that is built on this kind of frontier justice,
Yeah.
that you see in Westerns.
Yeah,
And
the very interesting thing also to my point of view and to us is how much Western is a sort of lens through which you are somehow looking at the American society, and exactly how you said, how American society represents itself, and it has the way it has changed during the time. It also changed the way the entire culture of Americans represents himself. Because I think that there are several points of change in the history. For example, I think Peckinpah was a point of change, as we said before, also because previously, may I say that the Western were used like also to represent the Cold War between Russians and the United States, and therefore it has always been a sort of political point of view. May I say that?
yes, absolutely. Yeah. And also in terms of gender, like, now more contemporary Westerns, you have filmmakers like Kelly Reichardt that are making Westerns that are kind of anti-Westerns in a way, not as violent, but with women at the core too,
Yeah,
because, it's such a male genre. And it used to be that it would be hard for me to teach women in the class. They just didn't care about these movies. They were like, oh, they're just men shooting at each other. But now you can sort of look at it as a way to explore masculinity and male, and sort of this idea we talk about in America of toxic masculinity. I'm sure it's something that, with the Me Too movement and in Italy, I'm sure it's something that you guys are looking at too.
yeah,
So what does it mean to be this kind of quiet, silent male that doesn't, that solves your problems with a gun, So there's so many ways to look at it that are so interesting, because these filmmakers, some of the great filmmakers, John Ford, like for instance, we were talking about The Searchers and how complicated the Ethan Edwards character is, because he's a racist, but he respects the Native Americans more than he respects the other white people. And he
yes,
knows their language and he hates them, but it eats him up on the inside and it destroys him. And it shows you what racism does to you. It's a very honest exploration of how racism and hatred will just destroy you from the inside out. So, I mean, there's just, untold number of Westerns that you can look at and try to understand how Americans think about themselves, and what the society um, sort of the foundations that's built on this idea of like structural racism. These are all the issues we're talking about in the academy right now. And I think it's very useful for students to be able to talk about those things, but also to have a visual education and to understand that there's you can learn how to make movies from these movies too.
Yeah, it is very peculiar, John, because it is both at the same time historical education on how powerful movies can be, and in this case, the Western genre are super powerful because I think the first Western is from Griffith, isn't it, in United States?
1903, The Great Train Robbery, just a very simple 12-minute movie, which is fascinating to look at now. So yeah, before it was even, that's before movies were projected, is when they were still looking at them on those little machines.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like I think less than 10 years after the Lumiere were starting their experiments, let's say. So it's really, really, really at the earliest times of movies. So we may say that the entire cinematography in the United States is built on the Western genre from Griffith. And it is the quintessential American epic mythical story of nation building on its triumphs, failures, fantasies, and even hypocrisies. And this is something that it is very interesting. And what fascinates me is the fact that you use it not only to teach, let's say, how much I want to use this word because I think it is clear how much politic it is to use movies to narrate an entire nation, but also you use it to teach how much you can use visual only without too much of a speech to narrate a story. So this combines a very directorial point of view with an historical and let me say point of view of a teacher. So this is very interesting, and how they react to that, how they react to the let's say to these two point of views.
Well, it'll be interesting to see because it's a class that I haven't taught in 3 or 4 years. And I feel like America has changed a lot in the last few years, through Trump and how the country looks at itself and violence and guns. So I'll be very curious. We're starting on Monday to see how this particular generation of American students see the movies, because it changes every time you teach it, depending on what the country is going through, which shows it's the same way that movies change. This idea, you look at a 1970s Western, and even though the costumes look like you're in the 1970s, that's the way we see history, through the contemporary lens. So it looks like a mixture of the old West with like 1970s clothing and hairdo. So it'll be interesting to see how they interpret these movies, and whether the movies speak to them in a way. And my job is just to frame it for them so that it can make sense, because they will say, well, why do I care about a Western? It's not something that, we don't ride horses anymore. We don't, deal with these issues. And in fact, I have to frame it for them to understand that this is a way for us to look at the country as it's evolved, and, and have a political viewpoint on these things as well. So it'll be curious to see how this particular generation um, does accepts them.
Yeah, and also how exactly how it evolves, because what is a Western now? We for sure Western has been as I said, a lens on a certain society, and most of all on how this society tend to narrate things about itself. But what is a Western now, and how it will evolve given the political situation, given what has changed in the last 4 years in America. The other interesting thing is that, do you think that this same approach or function, let's say, Western has had in the American society, was do you think it was the same for the spaghetti Western or for Sergio Leone? Do you think that this kind of portrait he did was somehow related to American culture, or was something else?
Oh, that's interesting. I think it's really the sort of film students after Sergio Leone that discovered him, right? And because he went off to Italy, he went off to Spain to make those movies and to do them cheaply. And I know that like Clint Eastwood and a lot of actors were saying, well, that was like a way, if you couldn't get work in Hollywood, you'd go to work with Sergio Leone or some of the Italian directors, and they didn't realize how, or maybe they realized when they were there, how much he was revolutionizing, you know, um, filmmaking. And I think now we understand, um, the greatness of those movies. But at the time, I don't know that people did. They just saw them like he's going off and doing these things really cheaply. But the beauty of his was that since he had to dub them and he didn't have, the actors were probably Italian, I guess you guys are going to dub anyway, but you have as little dialogue as possible. So you get things like the beginning of Once Upon a Time in the West, which is this like almost wordless 15-minute introduction that's just a mixture of like, amazing close-ups, long lens close-ups, and wide long shots mixed with this emptiness in the soundscape that in Morricone, his amazing music, but also the sound effects too, which are so beautiful and visual. Like he kind of sort of just pairs it all down in this very bare, like he's obviously watching John Ford movies, there's references to them
Yeah.
all through it, but he's just basically breaking it down to his essentials. And it's such a wonderful, like students today, they love those movies more than they like the original Westerns because they're so visual and because they see like how influenced Tarantino was. They love Tarantino and they see the Sergio Leone's and like, oh my God, he stole everything from Sergio Leone. And that's kind of fun to show them that.
Yeah.
So they appreciate it even more.
The strange thing is also that when Sergio Leone did that in Italy, he wasn't he wasn't a maestro. He wasn't seen as a maestro, but as a director of B movies.
Right.
And only now, let's say, only at the end of the 80s, starting in the beginning of the 90s, so 10 years after Sergio Leone mostly died, we thought, oh wow, this was amazing, this was incredible, this was a masterpiece. And but uh, but the interesting thing is that somehow, may I say, that Sergio Leone was not putting into his movies the political point of view on American society, but I may say a different political point of view, because he used Western on a political sense. If we think about, there's a movie called Giù la Testa, which is called, I don't know which is in the translation in English, the one with the Irish revolutionary guy. I think it's the third or fourth movie he did and this movie is talking about the Mexican Revolution, and this is it's a very political movie. So he used Western for a talk on politics, which is something that interests me really much, because it means that even when Western was kept off from, let's say, United States boundaries, it still remains as a mean to discuss political issues. And it is interesting because it never happens, or it happens not so often with other genres. And this is probably the most interesting and powerful thing about Western movies.
Yeah, I mean, you said there's a lot of profound things you said in there too, I think. So in terms of the B movie thing, Westerns were like, it's film noir and Westerns where directors learned how to make movies because they were cheap and they were easy and quick. So you get directors like Anthony Mann and Samuel Fuller, and they work in this genre to learn how to make movies, and make them quickly and cheaply and visually. So it's like a testing ground, for a lot of them. And I think Leone probably had that too. They were never taken seriously. Like John Ford won his Oscars for, movies like The Quiet Man and How Green Was My Valley. He didn't win for Westerns, because they just weren't taken seriously. So I think there's a parallel there. And, Leone, you understand the political, like when he does like Once Upon a Time in America, like these are very political movies too. And you
Yeah.
see where his sympathies lie. Um, but they're also extremely violent too. So I think the violence is something that speaks a lot to contemporary students. They are so used to the violence, and it's a genre that pushed violence further and further and further too. So that's a very American idea that, and it's probably something that appealed to Leone too.
What is John, the last Western movie that you saw produced in US? I mean the last before the COVID. Because I think that the last one I saw, oh well, it belongs to 2004 or something like that. So I'm not very up to date.
So what's really interesting now, I think, is that the Netflix just bought a movie called The Concrete Cowboy, which is about black cowboys. And then their big new movie that they're making is an all black Western with that Concrete Cowboy has Idris Elba, and he's in this new one too. Jay-Z is producing this all black Western. So it seems to me like the genre is about to reinvent itself again with
Yeah.
African American characters. And I'm very curious to see how they interpret it. You know, do they just kind of play it straight, or is there a commentary on race? So I think that the genre is about to change again, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get more female directors making westerns as well. So it just shows you how many stories there are that are left to tell, and it's such a plastic, fungible genre that you can use to tell any story you want.
Yeah, exactly. It's a plastic genre that you can use to rebuild constantly the myth of the birth of a nation, which
Right.
is incredible, and it happens only with Western, and it's very very interesting. I guess we have to close now because it was very interesting, but we've been going on for half an hour. We were supposed to go for 20 minutes. Now we are over 10 minutes. So a big thank you, Jonathan, for this little talk, and I hope that we'll see you again in Filmscom Network in at the end of 2021. We are already
Yeah.
projecting that, and
I'm, I'll be in Luca next year. Promise. Let's
yeah,
write it down.
okay. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Thank you very much for being with us.